All right, so what we're going to look at today is how does a plant transport materials? Okay, water in particular, because that's kind of the most obvious one, but we also need to look at the other materials that a plant needs to transport. Other than water, what else does a plant need to transport? Exactly, it's got to transport sugar. Okay, where is it making the sugar? Andrew, where is it making the sugar? You don't know where a plant makes sugar? What part of the plant makes sugar, carries out photosynthesis? Okay, the chloroplast, I was actually looking for a less specific answer. Just leaves would have been good, but yeah, chloroplast, very specific. Okay, now, where are the bulk of the chloroplasts? They're in that palisade layer that we looked at, okay, on the upper side of the leaf. Okay, that's where the majority of photosynthesis occurs. So the leaf can be very easily and very well supplied with glucose. However, not all parts of the plant are able to do that. Okay, if we're looking at like this palm over here, okay, or this pine here, okay, what do you notice about the stems? They're not green. Okay, so if we're talking about a big tree, like a giant sequoia, or a redwood or something like that, there's a lot of that plant that doesn't carry out photosynthesis, but still needs to be supplied with food. Okay, the other part of the plant that needs to be supplied with food is the roots. They can't carry out photosynthesis. Okay, they may have a few chloroplasts, but they're completely inactive. Okay, why are they inactive? They're underground. There's no light under there. It's very dark underground. Okay, so they're not carrying out photosynthesis. They need to be supplied with food. All right. Now, the leaves, they're carrying out the photosynthesis, but in order for photosynthesis to be carried out, they need water. And they're covered in a waxy cuticle. They can't absorb it. Okay, you've probably seen like in the morning sometimes, dew just kind of sits on the leaves of plants. It doesn't absorb. Okay? It does not absorb through the leaves. In fact, the fact that they're covered with a waxy cuticle is actually a good thing in terms of it doesn't allow the water to evaporate, but it also eventually makes the leaf tilt and the water runs off the leaf and onto the ground where the roots are. Okay, so it allows that stuff to go down there. But the leaves have to be supplied with water, and so the roots have to do that. So there's got to be some way for sugar to move down the plant and water to move up the plant. Now, is that going to happen in the same tubes? No. Can't have one thing going up and one thing going down in the same tube. It's like having an eastbound train and a westbound train on the same track. Okay, it's not going to work. Okay, they can't go in two directions at once. So there has to be two sets of tubes in a plant in order to do this. All right, so first point here, we're understanding how transport within cells is similar and involved in transport within a multicellular organism. So we are going to be looking at mostly here the passive processes. Okay, diffusion is a minor part of transport over a large scale because we know it doesn't work over long distances. Okay, but this is super important. Okay, osmosis is the reason or the method or the force that provides this transport for plants. Okay, so we're going to look at some structural stuff to do with plants today, general things like leaves, stem, kind of roots kind of thing. Okay, and then we're going to look at the forces that are involved in transport for a plant. Okay, remember, the weird thing about plants is this. Even if we're talking about a giant sequoia, okay, or a tree in the rainforest that could be 100 meters tall, they don't use any energy to transport water from the roots to the leaves. It's completely free. Okay? It requires no energy whatsoever to transport water from the roots to the leaves. There's no active transport involved. That's why we're looking at here just diffusion and osmosis. All right, so as we were talking about here just a minute ago, the resources that a plant needs are spatially separated. That means they are not in the same place. Water and nutrients are in the dirt. Sunlight is in the sky, okay? Not the same place. So a plant has to have specialization and division of labor within itself to acquire these spatially separated resources. right? There's lots of adaptations that plants have come up with, okay, over millions of years, okay, in order to deal with this. Okay, so the body of a vascular plant is differentiated into its root system, okay, that absorbs water and minerals, and a shoot system, an aerial shoot system, so that means above ground, okay, that makes food, carries out photosynthesis, supports the rest of the plant. All right, so some different adaptations that we've seen in different groups of plants here. So how many people have got like strawberries or raspberries at their house? Okay, so if you have raspberries, you ever notice what they do? They'll pop up everywhere. Okay, like raspberries, like I've had them in basically every house I've owned. Okay, and in the middle they'll be kind of against the fence, and then they'll just pop up in the middle of the yard. Okay, like a little raspberry bush will come up, and it'll be 10, 15 meters away from the rest of them, but they'll grow and they'll come up. It's not because a seed landed there. Okay, I pick all the raspberries. Okay, it's because these things put out things called stolons. Okay, strawberries do the same thing, right? So they put out this stolon. Strawberries will do it actually above the ground, but raspberries will do this under the ground. Okay, it's essentially an adventurous root. Okay, that just works its way to a new place and then becomes another plant when it gets exposed to the sunlight. Okay, potatoes can kind of do that as well. But yeah, it just pops up over here, and now you've got another plant over here that's carrying out photosynthesis, acquiring water and nutrients. The advantage to this is that this is now like a pipeline. So if resources are getting poor over here because this plant is very mature and has kind of exhausted all the minerals or water, okay, it can start taking them through the pipeline, okay, from the other part of the plant. So they can share their resources through this. Okay? Allows the plant to crawl essentially and get bigger. Some plants will use energy storage structures, okay, like rhizomes or tubers. Okay, potatoes are a tuber. Beets, okay, are kind of a tuber. Carrots, turnips, things like that. Anything that's a root that you eat, okay, is essentially, okay, what we call a tuber or a rhizome. And what that is a way for the plant to store energy. All right. So you're going to see it mostly in plants that are going to have to go dormant for long periods of time. This allows them to store some energy for when conditions improve. Then they can regrow the parts of the plant that died during the dormancy. Okay, so during the winter here, okay, if I'm looking at a potato plant, once the frost hits, okay, like October, the green leafy part of the potato plant is dead. Okay, it's frozen, it's toast. Right? But it'll grow back in the spring, provided I don't dig up the potatoes. Okay? If I don't dig up the potatoes will supply enough energy for a root system and a shoot system to grow. Okay? You've probably noticed that this happens if you leave potatoes in the pantry for too long. Right? You ever notice what happens to them? They get the little eyes. Okay? Those are the start of a root and shoot system for a new plant. If you leave them long enough, they'll look like a big giant spider. Okay? I left some, I forgot them in my basement for like 6 months. Okay? And I came down there one day because something smelled, and because they were starting to spoil. And I noticed that there was this one, and it was all like mushy. The potato part was all mushy, but coming out of it, there were legs, like roots, purple roots with little purple leaves on them because they weren't getting any sun. It was in the basement, it was dark. Okay? But they had grown to be about this long, each one of the little roots. Okay, but it had exhausted all of the energy that was in the potato. That's why the potato was all small and mushy. Okay? It had just used it all to try and get some shoots to somewhere where light would be available, okay, or where water would be available. Unfortunately, it failed because it was in the basement. Okay, but that's what they do. So if you're seeding potatoes, you're planting potatoes, you just go out and you buy a box of potatoes, you cut them in half, and you throw the halves in the ground, just like in The Martian. Okay, if you've seen the movie The Martian, that's what he did with the potatoes. Okay, you cut them in half, stick them in the ground. Fertilizer, not necessarily. Okay, but like on Earth, you don't need that. But okay, you put them in there, and they'll start to grow. Right, so that's one of the kind of strategies for a plant to survive a period of dormancy. Right, which is why we eat potatoes. They're full of calories. They're a very high energy food. Rhizomes and tubers contain starch. Starch is plant fat. Okay, it's the equivalent of fat for plants. Okay, if we have excess energy, we store it as fat. Okay, if plants have excess energy, there are some that will store it as sugars, maybe as oils, but most of them will store it as starch, which is just glucose molecules that are chained together and they get really long. Okay, that's why they're sometimes called complex carbohydrates. Okay, glucose is a simple carbohydrate. If you chain a bunch of them together, it becomes a complex carbohydrate or a starch. Right, so that's how plants, okay, will store their energy. Which is why if you're like looking to cut calories, one of the first things you should cut would be starchy foods, especially starchy foods that have been deep fried, because you have just taken energy storage molecules from both plants and animals and combined them into one tasty food. Okay, like French fries, for example. Okay, French fries are one of the highest calorie things you can eat because they're drenched in fat and they're starch. Okay, potato chips, same thing. Okay, starchy, drenched in fat. Okay, if you're just having like rice, well, then you're just getting the starches. Okay, still a lot of energy, still a lot of carbohydrates, but not so much with the fats. Okay, that sort of makes sense. And another way that plants can store energy would be at the base of their roots. Okay, onions do this in particular. Okay, the base of the root gets kind of fleshy and sweet, right? And so we'll see them in there as well. Okay, another place where plants, it's not really storage, but a lot of energy ends up there is if the plant is a fruiting plant. Okay, so a flowering plant that produces fruit. Okay, fruits are sweet because the plants invest lots and lots of sugar into the fruit. Okay, why do they do that? Because it's not like they can draw the energy from that fruit. Well, the flowers will attract the pollinators, but the fruit usually attracts animals. What's inside the fruit? Seeds. So they come, they eat the fruit, which means they eat the seeds. Then they go deposit the seeds in a nutrient-rich medium somewhere else. Most seeds can survive the trip through the digestive tract. Okay, they're made of cellulose, they're not going to get digested. Okay, so they go through the digestive tract, they get deposited away from the parent plant where there's no competition, and they get deposited in fertilizer and they grow really well. Okay, it's an excellent reproductive strategy for plants. Okay, now, do all plants want their fruit to be eaten? Not all of them. Okay, some plants, in fact, have evolved to have fruit that's poisonous. Okay, now in some cases the fruit is only mildly poisonous because in terms of an evolutionary thing, making the animal slightly sick means that the seeds go through the digestive tract faster. Okay, and there's less chance that they'll be broken down. Okay, or if we're looking at a plant that's the parent plant is going to die, it's not going to grow back the next year, it's what we call an annual, then those fruit are more likely to be preferred to be dropped so that the seeds grow where the parent plant was successful. That means that area was good for growth and it's better for them to grow there. So that would be the kind of plant that might have either poisonous fruit or fruit that is edible but is unpleasant. Okay, for example, like really, really spicy peppers. I mean, I love spicy peppers, but okay, a lot of animals don't like them. Okay, they take one bite of them and they won't eat anymore. Okay, because it's so incredibly hot. So that fruit just falls and is going to seed right there. Okay, all right, making some sense. So these are just strategies employed by plants for storage of energy, transport of materials, okay, that kind of thing. Now, the main two resources that plants compete for are light and water. Right? And I say compete, plants are competing with each other. Okay? Whichever one gets more light or more water or both is going to survive, okay, or do better or grow more. Right? So in order to compete for water, they need to have roots that are spread out or deep, okay, that can access water. If they're going to compete for light, they need to be one of two things, tall or wide, or both. Okay, which is why most trees are kind of umbrella shaped. Okay, they grow up and a little bit out in order to shade their roots, okay, to shade out their competition, okay, those kinds of things. In order to get tall, a plant's got to be able to support that weight, okay? And in some cases, we're talking about a lot of weight, okay? Not all plants are capable of doing this, right? As an example, these plants over here are not capable of growing very tall, okay? Which is why they kind of grow laterally instead, okay? They kind of spread out a little bit. Their stems are quite pliable, okay? So not very strong. So they wouldn't support very much weight, okay? Which is why it just kind of flops like that. Okay, over here, we've got that little pine and that palm. Can palms support a lot of weight? Okay, but what makes them different? What do they have in their stem? Wood. Yeah, okay, something like that. Some kind of wood-like material, okay, whether it's like bamboo or it's like actually like timber, okay, whatever it happens to be, it's some hard material that supports weight very well, okay? So this dragon palm here, I mean, it can get pretty tall, right? And it's, it's supporting itself, okay? Whereas this plant doesn't have a woody stem, it's green, okay? And you can see here that it's quite flexible, right? Not that the palms aren't flexible. If you've ever seen them in a hurricane, they can practically touch the ground on both sides when they're swinging, okay? But this one, it does a terrible job of supporting its own weight, which is why there's a big stick or broken javelin, okay, in each one, okay? Because I have to tie them to those or they fall over. Okay? They just don't have the ability to support all that big foliage. Where that plant naturally grows is in a rainforest, and it actually uses other plants to support itself. Okay? So it doesn't need to make like a hard wood-like material to support it. Okay? So in order to make this hard wood-like material, plants need this, lignin. Okay? Lignin is a material that acts like mortar. Okay, if you've ever like laid bricks, okay, or seen bricks, okay, or seen like stacked stone or something like that, okay, they put in between the stones mortar. It's like cement, okay? It's a glue for rocks, right? And it puts them together. Well, lignin is a glue or a cement or a mortar for cell walls. It cements them together and makes them stronger. Okay? By doing so, it hardens the cell walls, making them wood. Okay? So the bigger a plant needs to get, the more of this it's going to have to produce. And like I said, not all plants are capable of doing that. Okay? And not all plants use it for supporting growth. Some of them use it to protect seeds. Okay? Pine cones have a certain amount of lignin in them, okay? Especially the ones that are supposed to survive forest fires. Okay? Nuts, okay, those are, in a hard shell. There's a lot of lignin in the hard shell of a nut, okay, things like that. Okay, so lignin has a number of purposes. All right, so make sure you know what lignin is, okay, and it's a hard material that's embedded in the cell walls, okay, essentially, okay. Essentially makes their stems wood-like, okay? They obviously wouldn't secrete that into the leaves, okay? You wouldn't want the leaves to get like that. Okay, because once the cell walls become wood-like, they also become opaque. Okay, no more light is going to get inside that cell, so that cell is now going to no longer be photosynthetic. All right, turgor pressure. So we talked about this the other day, and I showed you that little like time-lapse video of the plant kind of coming back after having been really dry. Okay, so turgor pressure, if a plant doesn't have it, the plant looks like this. Okay, looks all wilted. Okay, the leaves are all kind of weak looking, right? So that one there on the left is this plant, okay, which was watered more recently, right? So you can see now that it looks quite a bit healthier, right? The leaves are kind of upright, okay, whereas here they're kind of curled and soft, okay, because that turgor pressure is gone. So when a plant has adequate moisture, the water vacuole or vacuoles, because some plants actually have more than one, okay, are full and they're pushing the cytoplasm and everything inside the cell against the cell wall. Okay, and that's supporting the cell wall from inside with this turgor pressure. Okay, so that's going to be an important term. Okay, pressure of water in vacuoles. Okay, as the plant becomes water stressed, okay, it's going to pull water out of the vacuoles. Okay, and it's going to start to wilt. Okay, now it's not pulling it out of the vacuoles like on purpose. Okay, it just kind of happens that way because of osmosis. Okay, as a plant becomes dehydrated, salts are going to start to pile up inside the cytoplasm, and that's going to start to draw water out of the cell walls. Okay, everyone all right with that? Okay. Now, when this condition becomes extreme, then the cell membrane can actually pull away from the cell wall. And when that happens, it actually pulls the cell wall in a little bit, and that really causes the plant to wilt. Right? Is it possible to recover that plant? Yeah, absolutely. Just water it. It'll come back. Unless it's crunchy, it'll be okay. Right? Now, like this plant, for example, used to be a lot bigger. Okay? Used to be really, really long because, well, it was very old. And then over the summer, nobody watered it. Okay? And it got essentially crunchy. Like the whole thing was like this. Okay? But there were a couple of stems that were still green. Okay? I watered it, came back. Right? Probably take now a few years for it to get back to anything resembling its former self, okay? But it will eventually. All right, so questions on that? So turgor pressure and lignified walls, okay, work together to support large, tall trees, okay? All right, so job of the roots, okay? Mainly we think of roots as just things that collect water. But in actual fact, they're also an anchor. Okay? Without roots, plants would tip over easily, especially in the wind. Right? So having roots allows them to hold on to the soil. Okay? It's why farmers typically now don't completely till up their fields anymore. Okay? Back when I was a kid, as soon as the crop was harvested or the following spring, farmers would completely till, that is like plow, their entire field. Right? When they did that, they broke up all the roots of the plants from the previous year, and they had all this loose dirt laying around. Well, if the dirt is loose, that was what I was going to say. Dirt is loose, okay? When the dirt is loose, there's nothing to hold it in place. If a strong wind comes up or you get a lot of heavy rain, what's going to happen to the soil? It just erodes. It washes away. Okay, if you ever seen like pictures like from the Depression in the 30s, you'd see those big dust clouds. Okay, that was the result of that. Okay, having all this loose dirt around. Okay, so as a result, most farmers now employ a zero-till strategy. There may be occasions where they occasionally plow up a field, but very rarely. Most of the time now, they leave the roots of the previous crop. They'll spray it with Roundup to kill it off so that it doesn't grow back from the roots. But okay, they'll zero-till and they'll go back the next year and they'll just put the seeds in right beside the crop that they planted the year before. Okay? The roots from the year before hold the soil down and prevent erosion. Okay? And they're also, when they decompose, they're nutrients for the soil. Okay? So roots are important for anchoring the plant. Now, roots come in two types. Okay? This type is a taproot. Okay? This is a fibrous root. Taproots tend to be a single deep root. Okay, a single deep root, like a carrot. Okay, a carrot would be a taproot. What's the advantage of a taproot? Goes further down, where the soil is actually less likely to ever dry out. Okay. What's the issue with a taproot? What do you have a lot less of that you would have in a fibrous root system? Surface area. Okay, now a taproot does typically still have little root hairs that come off of it. It's the little white things you see on a carrot that usually peel off. Okay, but those are the little kind of root hairs that do the majority actually of the absorption of water. Most of the carrot is energy storage. Okay, it's just starch, right? It's the plant storing energy, right? So the little root hairs are what do the bulk of it. Now, taproots, depending on the soil, can also be a very good anchor if the soil is really hard. If the soil is loose, a taproot is terrible, right? Because if a wind comes up and you've got this deep root, the top of the plant starts to sway and the bottom becomes a pivot point, right? So eventually you got the top moving, the bottom, the taproot will work itself loose and the tree will just fall over or break off, okay? Everybody kind of with me on that? So taproots are good in certain situations, okay, but in other situations, they're not as advantageous. Oddly enough, you see taproot plants and fibrous plants grow side by side all the time. Okay. Now, a fibrous root, okay, obviously has a greater surface area because the fibers can grow everywhere, but they typically don't go as deep. All right, so they are going to spread out more, which gives them a greater area over which to absorb water. Okay. But because they don't go as deep, they could be in a position where that plant would risk drying out more quickly, which is why, like if you have grass and a tree in your front yard, okay, like last summer when it was hot and we didn't get any rain, your grass burnt, but your tree survived. Okay, the tree needs way more water than the grass does, but it's got roots that went deep enough that the ground was still wet, okay, and it was able to pull the moisture out of there. Whereas the grass, the roots go down, maybe 6-8 inches, okay, tops. That was dry, okay, that was bone dry, so your grass gets dry. Okay. Now, fibrous roots can also be a very good anchor because, again, they've got more surface area that they're attached to, more dirt that they're holding on to. They're less likely to get uprooted, okay. They're less likely to break off, more likely to be uprooted. Okay, you'll typically see if a plant, if a big tree gets knocked over in the wind, a fibrous root system will still be on the bottom of the tree. Okay, the whole thing just goes over and the roots are just sticking up. Okay, if something has a taproot, they typically snap off. All right, they get that tipping, that kind of working it out, and they just break. Okay? So that's typically what you see. All right, job of the stems. We're going to take a break, then we're going to talk about the job of the stems. So I'll give you a 5-minute break here, okay, and then we'll talk about the job of the stems because I've been talking nonstop here. All right, so the job of the stems in a plant is to support all the foliage. Get it as high up as possible into the light, okay, where it can photosynthesize, right? So the role of the stem is just to support the foliage, okay, the photosynthetic parts of the plant. It is also where the bulk of new growth comes from, okay? Hence what we talked about the other day, stem cells, okay? The term stem cells came because typically you found undifferentiated cells that could become anything in parts of the stem, okay? Namely in the buds, okay? So the buds are usually the tips of stems. There's two kinds of buds. There's axillary buds and there's terminal buds that would be at the end of a stem, okay, that are more than likely going to become new leaves, okay? Axillary buds here would likely become new stem and new growth, right? Because, well, quite frankly, the biggest enemy of all plants is animals because they're food, okay? Plants are the first layer of, like, the food chain. So they're typically going to be eaten. They would prefer not to die as a result of being eaten. They would prefer to grow back, and most plants do. In fact, most plants grow back stronger after they've been eaten, right? The more you mow your grass, the thicker and better it looks because you're constantly cutting it down and making it grow from below. It makes it thicker, okay? If you have a hedge, how many people have ever gone to like a hedge maze? Anyone seen like a hedge maze? Okay, you've seen the corn maze, right? Well, they used to make those out of hedges, okay? These kinds of trees that they would just prune. The more you pruned them, the thicker they would get, because what would happen is if I cut it off right here, then the plant still has this leaf or this stem, and it's going to grow 2 new stems from these 2 buds. So a little while later, now the plant looks like this. It still has this branch and this branch, which were here and here, but now it's got even more foliage because it grew from those 2 little axillary buds. The more I cut it, the more it grows from further back, and that makes the plant look thicker and more full. So if we're talking about a hedge, okay, that's how you make a hedge look thick. Right? I'm sure you've walked by houses that have hedges, okay, like made out of little plants. Okay, the more you trim those, the thicker they look. They have them actually around the cemetery. They're on Big Rock Trail. Okay, right across the street from Big Rock Elementary. Okay, but that's a hedge. Okay, the more they trim it, the thicker it gets. All right, so stems will do that as well. They will be the location of new growth as well as the support for all the foliage. So they've got to have lots of lignin in their cell walls. They've got to have lots of turgor pressure, okay, in the cells because their job is support. Okay. All right, everybody good with that? Then we got the leaves, okay? This is probably the best diagram that you will get in your notes from me on the layers of the leaf, okay? So the leaves are the photosynthetic organ of the plant, okay? So in the leaf, okay, we've got the different layers. We've got the upper epidermis, okay, that's secreting the waxy cuticle, okay, so that's what that part's doing. Then below that we have the palisade layer, okay. I don't usually use the word mesophyll, layer is fine, okay, but the palisade layer is that layer of tightly packed, very vertical looking cells, okay, that are carrying out the photosynthesis. Below that layer is the spongy layer. The cells there still have lots of chloroplasts, but they're very irregularly shaped and they're not tightly packed at all. And that creates big spaces in between them that make it look like a sponge. Okay? In that area is where the bulk of the exchange of materials by diffusion is going on. Right? So any sugars made in the palisade layer are going to diffuse through the spongy layer and into this vascular bundle here, right? So on the outside of the vascular bundle are the cells or the tubes that carry sugar down to the roots. On the inside of that bundle are the tubes that bring water from the roots to the leaves. So there's 2 separate sets of tubes, okay, that are doing that job, right? And the bulk of the movement is by diffusion here. So water diffuses out of these center tubes and through the tubes that contain the sugar, okay? Now, what that does is it keeps the sap that's in the sugary ones from getting too thick. Okay? If that sap gets too thick, it won't run and the roots will starve. Right? So it's good to have the inside layer carrying the water because then the water has to actually go through the sugar and it thins it a little bit as it diffuses through. Okay. Then underneath that layer, obviously we have another layer of epidermis, okay, another layer of cuticle, and that is where our stomates are. Okay, stomates again are made up of 2 guard cells. Right. So typically leaves look like a blade. Okay, so there's like the typical kind of leaf shape is like this, kind of like a spade. Okay, kind of like that. So leaves typically have that shape. Okay, they've got the stalk. That's the part that's supporting the blade. Okay, then there's this part here called the petiole. That's where it joins to the branch or to the main branch. Okay, that's typically where the bud that created that leaf was. Okay, and then you've got this part here being the blade. So you got the blade, you got the stalk, and you have the petiole here. Okay, now they come in lots of different shapes, but that's kind of your typical leaf shape. I mean, obviously a maple leaf looks different than that, but it's essentially still the same thing. It's a blade, it's a stalk, it's a petiole. Grasses are a little bit different, okay, because they typically don't have a petiole because there's no branch for them to grow off of. They're basically just a blade. Okay? The blade just comes right out. What about a cactus? Does a cactus have leaves? Not that photosynthesize, no. But that's what the thorns are. Okay? On a cactus, the leaves have become so modified that they no longer carry out photosynthesis. They've become the hardened thorns of a cactus. The actual main body of the cactus is what carries out the photosynthesis. okay, the green part of the cactus. Now, this is your typical leaf, all right? So I want everyone to kind of know this one, all right? We call that a C3 leaf. It's what like 99% of all leaves look like, all right? A C4 leaf is more like what's on a cactus. Okay? They look a lot different because their main concern is the conservation of water. All right, so they will have, because they don't really have leaves per se, they have stomates top and bottom. Right, so this is really more to be flipped, so it's more like a cactus. Okay, the stomates are made up of 4 cells instead of 2. It creates an even tighter seal and ensures that water is only evaporating when the cactus wants it to. Okay? The palisade layer is arranged in a fan shape around the veinlet. Okay, so around the tubes that are carrying the water. Okay, and then you've got the spongy layer looks a lot different because if it had a spongy layer, that would lose a lot of water. Okay, so they actually call it a bundle sheath, okay, because it goes around the water carrying parts of the plant. Okay, and then there are spaces inside, okay, that basically just are kind of hollow. If you've ever tapped like a big saguaro cactus, you tap it, it sounds hollow inside. Okay. All right, so if that's the case, then where do you get water from in a cactus? Because everyone has this idea that, oh, if I was dying of thirst in the desert, I would just like cut a hole in a cactus and water would come out and I'd be able to survive and drink it. Yeah, it's in the fleshy part of the cactus. Okay, so you actually have to like cut a piece of the fleshy part of the cactus out and suck on it. Okay, it's about the same texture as like a melon, like a honeydew or a cantaloupe. It would be about that texture, but it's bitter. Okay, it's incredibly bitter because what does a cactus not want animals doing? Eating it. Yeah, exactly. Anytime a cactus gets a hole in it, and there are some birds that'll actually peck a hole in them and nest inside, okay, water can evaporate out that hole. Okay, it's very bad for the cactus if that happens. All right, so yeah, if you're dying of thirst in the desert, don't think that it's like a big cooler and you punch a hole in it and water comes out, because it just doesn't do that. Okay, you have to like suck on the fleshy part of the cactus. Okay, so we're going to go over this diagram here that shows all the parts of the plant, okay, kind of what they do in terms of transport. All right, so this diagram on the left here is showing you the tubes, that is the xylem tubes, that carry water up the plant. This is an electron microscope picture of what that looks like. So this line here is 100 micrometers. Okay. The bulk of the tubes are the tiny little ones. Okay, there are a few kind of bigger tubes there, but the bulk of the tubes are those really, really small holes, and they would be 10 micrometers or less in diameter. But there's lots of them. Okay, why does the plant not want really big tubes to carry its water? You're totally on the right track there, yes. Yes, partly. It partly is to do with that. Okay. Think about this. If you ever like use one of those big Slurpee straws versus like the little tiny thin straws, okay. If you're not drinking Slurpee, obviously a big straw is better for Slurpee because Slurpee is partially frozen and freezes together and can support itself inside a big straw. But if you try and drink a liquid through that big straw, easier or harder than a small one? Harder. Yeah. Because now you've got all this liquid and it's not supported. Okay, you've got a lot of weight in that tube. You have to create a lot more suction in order to draw the water up because there's more mass of water or liquid inside the tube. Okay, since the plant isn't using suction per se, okay, it's using osmosis, okay, to do this, it can't have big heavy columns of water to support. Okay, because two things are helping to support the column of water: osmosis creating a pulling force, and the polar nature of water. Okay? We talked about this back in the chemistry unit. Okay, those hydrogen bonds that form. Okay, so the water can hydrogen bond to itself and makes like that barrel of monkeys thing we talked about. Okay, so each water molecule is connected by a hydrogen bond to the one below it. Okay, and then water can also hydrogen bond to the inside of the tubes. all right, by adhesion. So we got cohesion, the water molecules together. We got adhesion to the inside of the tube. Are those hydrogen bonds very strong? No, and they break and reform very easily. If we're talking about a big column of water, the hydrogen bonds aren't strong enough to support the mass, and the water would just fall back down. But if the tubes are microscopic, then we got a better surface area to volume ratio, smaller mass of water inside the tube, and the hydrogen bonds are strong enough to support the column of water. And the force of osmosis is strong enough to pull the water up. Okay, it wouldn't be strong enough if we had big giant tubes. Okay, so this whole thing starts down here in the roots. Okay, the roots create an osmotic imbalance, okay, with salts. Essentially, salts become concentrated in the root tissue, which causes water to move out of the soil and into the plant. Okay, by doing so, that reduces the concentration of salts in the roots because water rushes in. The water then moves into what we call the xylem. The xylem are the water conducting tubes, the ones in the very middle. Okay, it moves into there and moves up the plant. Now the xylem tubes are in the center. Okay, we said that before. So there's two different kinds of sap. There's xylem sap, which is thin because it's all water, and then there's phloem sap. That's the sugary, thick stuff that's really sticky, okay, that we typically associate with the word sap. Okay. So the water is moving up the plant. Now what's causing it to move up the plant is what's happening here in step 4. As the water evaporates out the stomates, the salts that were in that water, okay, that were used to get it into the roots, that were in the soil that it absorbed, okay, get left behind in the spongy layer, causing the leaves to become salty by comparison to the water that's everywhere else in the plant. So water naturally moves towards the salt. Osmosis actually creates a pulling force that draws the water up. And because water is polar, it's connected to all the molecules are connected together or to the inside of the tubes and don't fall back down. Okay, so osmosis pulls it up and water keeps itself linked together. Okay. If you add certain things to water, okay, it makes it less able to do that and the plant can die. Okay, so certain things, if they get in the soil around the plant, will cause it to die because that process gets interrupted. Okay. Everybody with me there? All right. Now, if you'll see up here, okay, we got carbon dioxide coming in, oxygen going out, and light being part of that. So, okay, this is the exchange of gases that happen also through the stomates. Carbon dioxide coming in, oxygen, which is the byproduct of photosynthesis, step 6, okay, going out. As a result of that, we have sugar being produced, and the sugar moves down the phloem. The phloem is on the outside. Okay, that's why even a small nick in a tree causes that sticky sap to come out. Okay? So that stuff is on the outside of the plant. Do we need any special forces to move sugary sap down the plant? What's the plant going to rely on that's free? Gravity. Yeah, exactly. Gravity will do the job. Okay, so we don't need any special forces there in order to make that work. Okay, so the phloem is on the outside of the tree and it's conducting down the sugary sap. Okay, this was actually something that was cemented in my mind, not through the botany classes that I took in university, but when I was in staying in res, we had this nice open field behind our dorm where we would go out play baseball, football, whatever, when the weather was nice. One year they decided, the forestry faculty decided they were going to bring these trees that they had rescued from somewhere else, and they were going to plant them. And these were like really big old growth trees. And they were going to plant them in the field behind our dorm, in our football field, our baseball field. And they did. And we thought, man, that sucks because you can't really play football running into trees all the time. But we had a guy in our dorm who was in forestry. His nickname, incidentally, was Tree Mugger. Because he was in forestry, not tree hugger, tree mugger. Anyway, he said, that's okay, guys, we'll get rid of those trees. And we're like, look, we can't just go out there with a chainsaw and cut them down. We'll get caught and then we'll get in big trouble. We can't just go out there and cut them down. They transported these things hundreds of kilometers, to plant them here for whatever reason. It's like, no, it's okay. We're just going to ring them. I'm like, what does that mean? And he pulls out this little cable saw, okay, which is kind of like well, it's just a piece of cable, but it's kind of sharp on the edge. It's got rings on either end, okay? And you can cut through branches with it by just pulling it back and forth. It's essentially what you use to like prune trees. So he goes out there and he goes around each one of the trees right at the base, and he only cuts in about an inch, but he goes all the way around the tree. You could hardly see it. So if no one had known that anyone had done anything, but what he had done is he had cut the phloem. He'd gone deep enough that the phloem, the tubes that carried the sugar to the roots, were cut, and the sap was leaking out and not getting to the roots. So the roots were starving. So these trees all got really sick, okay? And they were like just about dead. And of course, the forestry faculty's like, "Oh man, what's going on with our trees?" And they discovered that we had done this. Well, they didn't know that we had done it, but they discovered someone, us, had done this. And it was in like the school newspaper, like it was crazy. Anyway, they rescued these trees again. Here's what they did. They gave them a skin graft. Okay, so if you get like a big chunk of your skin burned or taken out or whatever, they can graft skin from other places or other people even now, okay, onto that area. Well, what they did is they made paper mache. I kid you not, paper mache. And they put it over the ring that we had made on these trees. And the trees grew right over the paper mache, because what's paper? Trees. It was a skin graft for trees. And it went, and you could actually see, like in my last year there, I went back and you could actually see that the trunk of the tree had grown right over the paper mache. You could actually still see some of like the cartoons and headlines in this stuff after the tree had kind of grown over it. Okay? But it was a skin graft for the trees, and it saved them, and unfortunately the trees lived. But that's cemented in my mind. The phloem's on the outside. Okay? Phloem's on the outside. If you're tapping a tree for like maple syrup, okay, like we all have this vision, people are pounding this tap into the tree. The tap only goes in about this far. Okay, it only needs to tap the phloem. We don't want to tap the xylem, because then water just comes out of the tree. Okay, you don't want to put that on your pancakes. You want the maple syrup. You want the maple sap. Okay, to come out. But yeah, but pancakes get soggy otherwise. So we're looking for just the stuff that comes out of the phloem. Okay, now it's also, people also have this idea that maple syrup producers, they put the tap in the tree, they crank it open, and maple syrup comes like pouring out of the tree. It's drip, drip, drip. It's a very slow process, and which is why real maple syrup is so expensive, okay, because it takes a long time to acquire it. Okay, so we got phloem sap coming down, and then that phloem sap goes to the roots, and the roots are able to carry out cellular respiration. That is, they can burn the sugar for energy because they can't produce it themselves. All right. I would like you guys to answer those 7 questions, okay? And we will have time, I think, to go over those before class is over. Okay, so have a look at those. Tomorrow you will have a quiz. Okay, and it'll be on plants this time. Okay, we're kind of done with the cell diagram stuff, so that'll be on plants and how they function and multicellularity. These are not questions. These are the numbers that go with the diagram. Sorry, that makes more sense now, right? Because they're not questions, they're statements. Because they go with these numbers in this diagram. Okay, I just explained them and then forgot that I put them on the next page. Okay, so let's go to transport and plants, because I forgot to talk about that part. Okay, so this is what the inside of the plant looks like. We said the phloem, okay, and that's a term you need to know. Okay, the phloem transports the sugary sap. Okay, and it's transporting it down the plant with gravity. Okay, and it's near the outside. The xylem is actually made up of old phloem tubes. Okay, that's what the xylem is actually old phloem tubes, because a plant grows by adding layers to the outside of it every year. That's why when you cut down a tree, you see rings. Those represent where the outer edge of the tree was, okay, every growing season. Right, so what we have is xylem tubes being where the phloem was. The ring essentially represents where was the phloem each growing season. Right, the wider a ring is, the better that year was for the plant, because it grew a lot. If it's a really thin ring, then it might have been a really dry year, a really cold year, or something like that. Okay, so that's what that looks like if we're looking at a cross section, okay, of the plant. Now, the xylem, as we said, is old phloem tubes, so it looks very similar to the phloem tubes that are here on the right, except that these sieve plates, that's what this is, okay, have essentially been broken, right? And they get broken because they're designed to keep big chunks of sugar from forming. Right, so the chunks, if a chunk of sugar starts to form, it hits the sieve plate, and the weight of the sap above crushes it and breaks it up. Okay, and then the pieces can fall through and redissolve. Okay, it essentially just keeps the tubes from being blocked. Okay, by allowing sugar to crystallize and get too big. Okay, and then the phloem tubes are inside of that. Okay. All right, so yeah, make sure we know phloem and xylem. Right, so the xylem transports water up the plant. Okay, it does that using osmosis. Okay, we've described that process several times now. Okay, as well as the adhesion and cohesion of water molecules. That will definitely be a written response item on your unit exam. Okay, explain how a plant transports water. That's something you got to explain. Okay, so as water evaporates, that would be kind of this whole paragraph right here. Okay, as water evaporates from the leaves, the remaining solution in the spongy layer in the xylem becomes saltier, okay, becomes more concentrated. That pulls more water up the stem to balance it, okay? And the same process allows the roots to take up water, right? So we got osmosis, we got adhesion and cohesion, okay, working together, and that's what this diagram is showing here. So we got cohesion, a hydrogen bond between two water molecules holding them up, okay? A hydrogen bond here between the water molecule and the inside of the xylem, holding, again, this chain of water molecules from falling back down. Okay? And what's pulling on that whole chain is the osmotic pressure, essentially from above. Okay? And then the phloem, okay, the phloem transports sugars, okay, and it takes them down to the roots, okay, so down the plant, okay. Process is slow, okay, and it just uses gravity. Okay, so some osmosis and diffusion is still required, but that's mostly just for the viscosity. Okay? It's not about like creating a force that pulls it. It's about reducing the viscosity of the sugary sap. Okay? If the sap gets too sugary, osmosis will cause water to move in to thin it, and it moves in, it diffuses through. Okay? Now we have the questions. So these 5 questions are the ones I would like you to answer, and I think we'll still have time to go over those. Okay. All right, let's look at question number 1 here. So on number 1, we've got what process or properties are used in both intracellular transport and transport in multicellular organisms? Okay, so how are they used? What were the 2 that we talked about? Osmosis and diffusion, right? Active transport is not going to work because active transport requires the little carrier transport proteins that are embedded in the cell membranes to work. It doesn't work over a long distance. I mean, not that diffusion works well either, but at least diffusion is helping to move some things over short distances. Osmosis, on the other hand, can create a pulling force that can act over a great distance. Okay. All right, for number 2, if you're tapping a maple tree to harvest sap for syrup, which transporting tissue would you tap? The phloem, yeah, the phloem is the one that's carrying the sugary sap. Okay, that's what we want. All right, and where is it located? It's on the outside of the plant. Okay, and in fact, you'll even see in the wintertime, deer and other herbivores will actually chew on, it looks like they're chewing on the bark of like aspen and poplar trees. But what they're doing is they're actually biting through the bark and eating the frozen sap that's in the phloem because it's full of sugars. Okay, so they'll actually gnaw on the sides of trees. So if you're walking and you see like a bunch of kind of dark marks on the lighter bark of the tree, that's usually where animals have gnawed on the tree during the wintertime. Okay. Number 3, in the leaf, why are so many cells packed together near the surface of the leaf? Okay, so that's the palisade layer that we were talking about, and its job is to carry out what, Jeremy? Yep. Carry out photosynthesis, right? We want as many cells, as many chloroplasts exposed to the sun as possible. Okay, that's why the palisade layer looks the way it does. Okay, how is it supplied with water? Well, the water diffuses out from the xylem through the spongy layer and into the palisade layer. Okay? As they're using it up, water is just naturally moving that way. Okay? Right, number 4, would a plant be able to transport water to its leaves more easily or less easily on a really humid day? Well, actually, it's going to be less, because if there's already a lot of water vapor in the air, then it's harder for more water vapor to get into the air. Okay, so on a really, really humid day, okay, you're not going to see as much evaporation. On a dry day, the rate of evaporation is much higher. Okay, it's not necessarily that the rate of photosynthesis is any higher, okay, or lower on a dry versus a humid day, but the rate of water loss on a less humid day is much greater than on a humid day. Okay. And for number 5, you have a plant that does not look very full. It only has a few stringy branches. What would you do to give it a more full appearance? Well, watering it's going to make it, have water, but it's not going to make it get full looking. Okay, remember we were talking about the hedges? Okay, if I want it to grow more foliage, I need to do what to it? Cut it, yeah, prune it, okay, make it grow from buds that are further back on the plant. All right, your quiz will be posted later on this afternoon. Make sure you check that out tonight.